Not too long ago, we brought you an episode looking at a few examples of the almost nuclear states of the Cold War. Countries like Argentina, Sweden, and South Africa that were on the road to developing nuclear weapons, or even developed them but never tested them. We had left a country out, however, whose nuclear program has been very prominently in the news lately. And really not just lately, but over the 30 years. I am, of course, talking about the Iranian nuclear program, which, unknown to a lot of people, has actually been in existence since the early days of the Cold War, supported then by many of the countries that now oppose it. I'm your host, David, and today we are going to look at the history of nuclear Iran. This is the Cold War. So this story starts in the 1950s. By this point in the Cold War, there were firmly two warring camps, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were looking for ways to not only bolster their alliances, but also bring new countries into their respective folds. Up to this point, nuclear development was largely a taboo subject, and nuclear programs remained outside the reach of all but a select few of the most powerful and rich countries. This began to change under the early Eisenhower administration, however, as the US recognized that its nuclear know-how could be used as a type of currency to strengthen its relationship with select allies. In December of 1953, in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly, he introduced what would become known as the Atoms for Peace program, a watershed in the concept of non-weapons related nuclear development. Eisenhower wanted to refocus attention away from the destructive military power of nuclear weapons and shift attention towards the non-military, civilian prospects of nuclear energy. Eisenhower called for the creation of an international nuclear energy agency through the United Nations, which would encourage and monitor the use of nuclear energy for the peaceful pursuits of mankind. This included in particular a goal to, quote, provide abundant electrical energy in the power-starved areas of the world. The United States proclaimed its readiness to provide nuclear know-how, the technology, and infrastructure to countries interested in developing civilian nuclear programs. That international agency, by the way, would be created in 1957 as the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, this is where Iran enters the story. Under the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, Iran was a key American ally in the Gulf region. It was also one of the first countries to express interest in nuclear cooperation with Washington. The oil-rich nation was certainly not shy of the ability to finance a nuclear program, and the Shah was eager to not only develop the Iranian economy, but was also keen to earn the prestige that would come from being a member of the nuclear club. For the Americans, it was an opportunity to solidify an alliance with a key regional partner, as well as gain financially by selling the expensive nuclear equipment and know-how. In the words of Robert Einhorn, a former American arms control official who was part of the team dealing with Iran, quote, "We gave Iran its starter kit. We weren't terribly concerned about nuclear proliferation in those days, so we were pretty promiscuous about transferring nuclear technology. We got other countries started in the nuclear business." Now, we should keep in mind that at the time, it just didn't seem realistic that other countries would ever have the potential to develop their own nuclear weapons. In light of this, in 1957, Iran and the United States signed a nuclear cooperation agreement. In 1959, the Tehran Nuclear Research Center was established. By 1967, a 5-megawatt research reactor, given by the United States, had come online at the site. The highly enriched uranium that was fueling the reactor was also supplied by the United States. In a signal to the world that their program was intended for peaceful purposes, the following year saw Iran sign on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Everything seemed to be working out exactly how Eisenhower had envisioned in his Atoms for Peace program in 1953. But as Iran continued to grow rich from its oil reserves, the Shah's appetite to see Iran as the most important regional player in the Gulf increased. Tehran invested heavily in both industrialization and the development of infrastructure. It also spent lavishly on expensive Western military equipment, especially from the United States. The Shah, however, also wanted to keep his options open regarding their nuclear program. In 1973, Akbar Etermad, a leading Iranian nuclear physicist, was invited to meet with the Shah at his palace. During the meeting, the Shah expressed a desire that Iran should have a more comprehensive nuclear program. Etermad was tasked with developing a plan. 2 weeks later, a 13-page draft strategy was presented to Mohammad Reza. The Shah then ordered his prime minister to do whatever was necessary to implement the plan. Ayatollahs revealed in a 2003 interview with the newspaper Le Figaro that he asked the Shah if he intended to build a nuclear weapon. According to Ayatollahs, the Shah responded that it was the wrong time for Iran to do so, as possessing a nuclear weapon would isolate Iran diplomatically, but that the country should be prepared to build a weapon if other states were to build one and if the security situation demanded it. In 1974, Ayatollahs was appointed as the chief of Iran's new atomic energy organization. Within the agency, a special nuclear research team was created whose purpose, according to Ayatollahs, was to, quote, give the country access to all technologies, given the political decision makers the possibility of making the appropriate decision and doing so while time permitted them to build a bomb if that's what was required. 1974 was also the year the Shah announced plans to build 23 nuclear reactors over the course of the next 20 years. Investment was made into human resources. Physicists were sent to study abroad on the condition that they were to return to work on Iran's domestic nuclear program. By some reports, by 1977, the approximate 1,500 employees of the Atomic Energy Organization were among the best paid government employees in the country. The AEO had the second largest budget of any public organization in the country, only surpassed by NIOC, the state oil company. Significant resources were also made into domestic uranium mining. Of course, despite all of this investment, Iran was still forced to rely on the United States and several European nations for the supply of the advanced technology and construction techniques required to build nuclear infrastructure. To this end, also in 1974, the Shah traveled to Paris to sign a nuclear cooperation deal with French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. The deal included the supply of new reactors, technology, and more uranium to be used as fuel. It also included the training of nuclear scientists and engineers. But more importantly, it marked Iran's first steps towards firm nuclear cooperation with Europe. Tehran would go on to buy out Sweden's 10% stake in the uranium enrichment consortium Eurodif, joining France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain as owners. In exchange for their more than $1 billion investment, Iran received a portion of the enriched uranium produced by Eurodif. Iran also reached an agreement with Framatome, a French nuclear engineering firm. That deal was to see the construction of 8 nuclear power plants. However, the Islamic Revolution saw that none of these plants even saw the start of construction, let alone final completion. The agreements with France were followed the next year by an agreement with the German firm Kraftwerk Union, itself a subsidiary of Siemens and not to be confused with the pioneering EDM band of the same era. Kraftwerk were contracted to build 2 1,200 megawatt pressurized water reactors in the coastal city of Bushehr. Significant progress on the first plant was made before the collapse of the Pahlavi regime and the Islamic Revolution forced construction to be halted. This, incidentally, is the same Bushehr site that has been one of the foci of so much attention in the present day, following the completion of the plant with assistance from the Russian Federation. But moving back to the 1970s, Iran not only signed agreements with South Africa to purchase uranium, but also an agreement with the United Kingdom to receive training support. They were also in advanced negotiations with London on an agreement for the UK to build up to 20 new power plants in Iran in exchange for a $20 billion investment in the British nuclear industry. Other discussions with both Argentina and with Italy for further nuclear deals had also begun, demonstrating how wide a net Tehran was trying to cast in its goal of pursuing its nuclear goals. All of this, however, came to a halt in the 1980s, however, the result of the Islamic Revolution. Okay, so that's a brief overview of the Iranian plan. But Tehran wasn't developing their program in isolation. Global events kept happening and other countries reacted, notably the United States. Washington was Tehran's most staunch ally and had effectively launched the Iranian nuclear program. But the global nuclear situation was very different by the 1970s than it had been in the 1950s. Proliferation was a significant concern. 1968's Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which became effective in 1970, determined that in order to minimize the risk of nuclear conflict, the only nuclear weapon states were to be the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France. India's detonation of a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974 created a great deal of tension and unease and reinforced the wariness towards proliferation that had been growing in the United States. So we need to keep this in mind when looking at discussions and negotiations between Tehran and Washington after 1974. The US wanted guidelines that Iran, despite being a close ally, had no intention to build a bomb. Declassified documents from both the Ford and the Carter administrations demonstrate the levels of American concern. A 1974 State Department cable expressed concern over the possibility that if the Shah's regime was to collapse, it would allow unfriendly forces to seize a nuclear weapon, or at the least, the materials to be able to build one. Quote, domestic dissidents or foreign terrorists might easily be able to seize any special nuclear material stored in Iran for use in bombs. An aggressive successor to the Shah might consider nuclear weapons is the final item needed to establish Iran's complete military dominance of the region. CIA analysis determined that if the Shah, quote, is alive in the 1980s, if Iran has a full-fledged nuclear power industry and all the facilities necessary to make nuclear weapons, and if other countries have proceeded with nuclear weapons development, we have no doubt that Iran will follow suit. These fears were only exacerbated in an interview the Shah gave to Le Monde in February of 1974. When asked if Iran intended to develop nuclear weapons, the Shah gave an otherwise unexpected answer, quote, without any doubt and sooner than one would think. This, of course, was not an answer he was supposed to give, and everybody around him went into damage control mode. The Iranian embassy was told to simply deny that the Shah had ever said this, while officials in Tehran stated firmly the line that His Imperial Majesty actually said Iran is not thinking of building nuclear weapons, but may reverse its policy if other non-nuclear nations do. After all, in the world of Lionel Hutz, there is the truth, and there's the truth. Unease in Washington continued, despite Iran not having the capabilities to build a bomb, nor the likely capacity to do so over the coming few decades. India's Smiling Buddha test in 1974 helped to solidify the American position towards Iran's continued nuclearization. While Iran was keen to continue to work with the United States, including the purchase of 8 more reactors, the Ford and then Carter administrations were wary. They continued to engage in nuclear talks with Tehran, but any deals for equipment and technology had to come with safeguards that they couldn't be used for weaponization. The deals with France and other nations, however, had no safeguards on the technology or facilities, giving the French and the Germans especially an edge in securing the lucrative trade deals. Declassified National Security Council documents from 1975 and 1976 show that the United States had specific concerns regarding Iranian interest in reprocessing and separation of plutonium. Of course, the separation of plutonium can also be used to provide fuel for a civilian reactor, but it's also a key part of the creation of weapons-grade plutonium. Both Ford and Carter insisted on American control over US-supplied nuclear material, offering instead to Iran the opportunity to invest in the Bechtel Corporation, which would launch a jointly owned uranium enrichment facility to be located in the United States. Alternately, the US also offered that if Iran insisted on the construction of a facility in Iran, that the reprocessed material had to be returned to the United States. The Shah rejected these offers, insisting on Iran's right to control the full fuel cycle as per the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, in what can be seen as strikingly modern rhetoric. Iran figured that since other nations could do it, they should be able to as well. The concerns from others, as in the present day, was the simultaneous denial of an intent to build a nuclear weapon while also rejecting any form of supervision. A real trust me bro moment. But amidst the ongoing negotiations with the United States, the Shah vocally complained about this double standard. When speaking with French journalists in 1976, he asked, "Why is it normal for you, the Germans and the British, to have atomic or hydrogen bombs while it is not for Iran? It is not automatically protected by any other country. Why, for Iran, is a simple matter of self-defense a problem?" His complaints, clearly about weaponization, went well beyond references to a peaceful civilian nuclear program. Now, American concern was not just fueled by the words being spoken, but also by concrete actions. In January of 1975, Iran began exploring the option of purchasing nuclear missile submarines from France, a deal that didn't actually go anywhere, but the expression of interest was certainly a red flag. Additionally, Tehran expressed interest in purchasing the American MGM-52 Lance surface-to-surface missile system, notable for its support for nuclear-armed warheads. Both of these systems were quite expensive and had cheaper conventional-only equivalent options that could have been pursued. The additional expense would only make sense if nuclear capability was a desired criteria. There were additional concerns from the US Department of Defense over the scale of the planned Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. Of particular concern was the unusually large size of the center itself and planned large hot lab, which would be a necessary first step towards reprocessing. But despite these concerns, a deal between the US and Iran was reached. The Shah knew that the United States, as the most advanced and powerful nuclear nation, was Iran's best bet in furthering their own nuclear program. As for the Americans, they didn't want to alienate their key regional ally. And besides, despite the reservations, there was a lot of money to be made. With the help of Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, who appealed to the Shah's vanity by comparing him to Alexander the Great, an agreement was finally reached. The deal, signed by Carter and the Shah, needed congressional approval, but allowed for the supply of 8 light-water nuclear reactors. In exchange, Iran agreed not to produce plutonium or any other weapons-grade nuclear fuel using American nuclear material or technology, without American authorization. Of course, as we all probably know, none of this really mattered, as one of the ebbs and/or flows of history swept all of these things away. In 1978, the protest movement in Iran, fed up with the oppressive regime of the Shah, forced Mohammad Reza into exile. This then led to not only the fall of the monarchy, but the emergence of an Islamic theocracy. The new regime, initially at least, rejected the nuclear program, viewing it as an example of the extravagant and useless spending of the old regime. But by the 1990s, nuclearization was back on the docket and has remained a topic of interest and concern for both Iran and much of the world since. The Iranian nuclear program took its first steps during the Cold War, driven by the Shah but enabled by the West, especially the United States, eager to ensure a strong regional ally in the Persian Gulf and directly on the Soviet Union's southern border. Despite significant reservations over the possibility of weaponization, Washington deemed the risk acceptable. Iran was led by the Shah, who actively looked to join the nuclear club to boost his own prestige, as well as to make Iran the most powerful country in the region. That Iran did not join the nuclear club in the 80s or 90s is the result of one of the chances of history. Since Iran's renewed interest in nuclearization, however, the specter of a nuclear Gulf region has re-emerged, with the Russian Federation stepping in to lend assistance, much as the United States had done during the Cold War. In response, the United States, Israel, and others in the West have worked to either ensure that Iranian nuclear development has been directed towards peaceful civilian purposes, or, in more extreme cases, to physically destroy any progress that Tehran has made towards weaponization. It is interesting to note that much of the justification for nuclearization put forward by the current regime has direct echoes to the justifications put forward by the Shah. Another example of something old being something new once more. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is hanging out down by the cyclotron again, where it's hoping to run into that other bell button from that science channel because they think they're cute. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.